Hey, how's it going? It's Robin Smith, and it's time for the Robin Smith Show for Sunday, May 4th, 2025. May the 4th be with all of you. Welcome to the podcast. Today on the show, I bring you my conversation with Chelsea Rose Odhner, Robert Falconer, and Dr. Jonathan S. Rose to talk about their upcoming book, Opening the Inner World, Spiritual Healing, Internal Family Systems, and Emanuel Swedenborg. But first, before we get to that conversation, congratulations to the Washington Capitals. Way to go, guys. Way to go. Caps win round one. Take that, Montreal. You can boo our national anthem all you want. Caps have not won a round one victory since 2018 when we got the cup. So I'm super excited. And if you watch the regular season games against the Carolina Hurricanes, you know that this round two matchup against Carolina, this is going to be exciting. This is going to be like... This is where all the fighting happens. I can't wait. I cannot wait. I want to thank John Potts. Have you ever had this where you know a song and you don't know the name of the song? This actually happened on the podcast. I can't remember which song it was. I asked you all, can you help me out? And some listeners emailed the show and helped me. I don't even remember what the song was now. Oh, it was... What's that guy? Stepping Out by Joe something. Oh, gosh, I can't remember now. By Joe, not Joe Wilson. Hold on. Stepping Out by Joe Jackson. Oh. Anyway, the song that I couldn't think of, I've been chasing this song. It's in Superman 2, the fight scene when Clark Kent, he gets beat up by the bully and he doesn't have his Superman powers. Or maybe it's the scene when he actually gets him back. It's a song playing. It's by I was singing that. We hosted a Caps game watch party, and one of the neighbor guys is like, "Oh yeah, that's Average White Band. Pick up the pieces." And I'm like, "Oh my god, yes! Thank you, John Potts. Big shout out to you." I got a chance to test out my electric chainsaw. There's been a fallen tree. It's been back there. I don't want to admit how many months. It's been back there on our fence for a while, okay? And there was also a tree that fell back beyond our property that I had the county come over, and they were like, yeah, it's not our job. We're just going to, I think the state of Maryland, it's literally like the property between between people's plots of land is the state of Maryland, not the county. And they're like, state of Maryland's not going to do anything. It's like, just let the wood rot. I'm like, but that's a huge eyesore. I mow that. I keep that part up, even though it's not my responsibility. I mow it. Anyway, that battery, I use the Ego. I got a Ego leaf blower. I mean, in Montgomery County, you're not allowed to have gas-powered anything anymore. I don't know. I think I can still mow my lawn with a gas-powered lawnmower, but you're not allowed to have gas-powered leaf blowers, etc. So I got this Ego leaf blower. It's the most powerful one in the industry, even compared to gas-powered ones. I went out on my roof and I hit that turbo button, and it just, I annihilated all the leaves in the gutters. And so the battery is transferable. So now I'm like, well, what do I ask for Christmas? Let me ask for a chainsaw. So I finally got to break it out, and that thing lasted. I was out there for over a half hour. I was sure that the battery wouldn't last that long, but I got the job done. I was like, what's going to break first, my body or this battery? Turns out it was my body. Also, fun fact, the poor mailman, there was some kind of a bee that had decided to build her nest. I thought it was a him. Turns out there were little babies in there. Our family member was coming over and helping garden or whatever, and I had knocked it out in the morning so that it wouldn't torment the mailman. And I was like, yeah, if you want, cousins were over. I was like, oh yeah, you want to show your son, we can cut it open. She looked at it. She was like, there are babies in here. And I'm like, oh, no, don't tell me. I mean, these babies are obviously goners. The mommy shouldn't have built in the Washington Post mailbox thing. But our mailbox is so old that the wood is kind of rotting. It's kind of calling nature to take it out, the slow-moving demolition process, decomposition process. So anyway, we need a new mailbox. We need to get to the interview. Let's get to the interview, shall we? It's also time for new gutters. I'll ramble about that later. I want to hear from you all. If you have a suggestion for a guest or a topic to cover, or if you have a question, you can write into the show at robinsmithshow@gmail.com. You can leave a voicemail on the show's hotline, 301-458-0883. You can help me identify a song that I sing into the microphone, and I'm like, what's this song? If you know it, reach out. If you're a fan of the show and you'd like to support it to reach more listeners, you can share it with friends, family, colleagues, subscribe, follow, rate the show, all that stuff, favorite podcast app, reviews, welcome, yada, yada. Become a supporter on Patreon. Before I read bios, I also want to say 2 out of 3 of the guests on this panel are musicians. I don't know if Bob plays an instrument. I should have asked him. But Jonathan has this album. You should go check it out. Clear Shining After Rain. So this is Jonathan Rose, Clear Shining After Rain. And then Chelsea's got an album, Confident Hope. I asked their permission if I could play some tracks, and they said yes. So I'm going to see if I can get those tracks up and running for next episode. But if you're curious, just go check those out now. And now let's introduce our guests. Okay. Chelsea Rose Odhner is the Vice President of Publishing for the Swedenborg Foundation, a Level 1 trained internal family systems practitioner and a licensed massage therapist. Chelsea's work spans writing, musing, and spiritual content strategy, including their original spiritual music album, Confident Hope. Trained in yoga philosophy and interfaith dialogue, they work to highlight important intersections in the areas of spiritual growth, psychological understanding, and creative expression. Chelsea works one-on-one with clients virtually and in person in Glenside, PA, at their practice Locus of Healing. Robert Falconer is best known for his extensive involvement with internal family systems therapy as a practitioner, teacher, and writer. For the past decade or more, Bob Falconer has devoted himself full-time to IFS work. In that time, he has attended all levels of IFS training offered and has been at many workshops and events with Richard Schwartz, both as assistant and participant. In addition to studying with many of the other senior IFS trainers, he also co-authored a book with Richard Schwartz entitled Many Minds, One Self. His other books include The Others Within Us and When You're Going Through Hell, Keep Going. His focus is now on the study of spiritual presence experiences. Jonathan S. Rose, Ph.D., is a scholar and translator of the works of Emanuel Swedenborg. As series editor of the New Century edition of Swedenborg's Theological works, he has dedicated his career to making complex spiritual concepts accessible through meticulous translation and research. Dr. Rose has authored works including The Message of Love, Behind the Ten Commandments, and Swedenborg's Garden of Theology, and been the host of the Spirit and Life Bible Study. Beyond his scholarly pursuits, Dr. Rose is also an accomplished musician who explored spiritual themes in his eclectic gospel album, Clear Shining After Rain. Rose has a passion for exploring the therapeutic potential of Swedenborg's teachings, inspired by innovative psychologists like Wilson Van Dusen, Raymond Moody, and Jerry Marzinski. In his work, he aims to help people know and understand Swedenborg's works so that they can connect with heavenly inspiration and healing. And now I bring you Chelsea Rose Odhner, Bob Falconer, and Jonathan S. Rose. People are going to be aware of what internal family systems is, and I do want to go over a little, or invite you, whoever, all of you are qualified to give a brief orientation to Swedenborg. But before we do that, even, I want to start by just asking, how did this project come about? What inspired you? When did you get the idea planted to do this work, to write this book?
Yeah, I can start us off with that because I think it grew out of my own journey when I found IFS. Well, I can speak really to how it came up in my life. And I had found IFS. I had known, Swedenborg forever, had been a student of Swedenborg for a really long time and raised in a community that, reads Swedenborg's works and everything. And I had finding IFS. I mean, I'd been on my own trauma healing journey. and had done a lot of yoga and different kinds of therapy and all this sort of stuff and meditation, so much to sort of heal myself inwardly one way or another, but never really felt like anything had traction inside. It really felt like, I always sort of have described it as just feeling like this just like black mass, inside of like, what do you do? It's just this darkness in there. What can you do about it? And when I was first introduced to IFS through a therapist that just heard me describing parts of myself, was sort of reflecting back to me what I was saying, and then, introduced me to the IFS model. I just found it so intuitive. I think a lot of people do. When you just start talking to your parts, you're like, oh yeah, of course, this is what we are inside. But not only for that, but also because of everything Swedenborg writes about the mind and our spirit. And so to be introduced to this psychotherapeutic model that has this concept of self and parts and everything, it just lit me up. And I, started studying and reading everything I could in terms of IFS, but really had this curiosity of who in the IFS world has run into Swedenborg, because someone out there must have, because the overlap is just amazing. Like, there's so much to explore. And, as luck would have it, Bob was coming out with the book, The Others Within Us. And I happened to watch one of his early videos that was announcing the book, and it was a demo with somebody. And I was like, here he is. I was like, this guy must have heard of Swedenborg. I hadn't read the book yet. I ordered it right away. I cold wrote to Bob through his website to just ask if we could meet. I was just so enthusiastic. I just felt so much joy at the possibility of getting to connect. And Bob responded, and I, so we got to meet, and I think within the first conversation or two, I said, will you write a book with me? Because I just wanted to write a book on IFS and Swedenborg. And then, to my delight, Bob said yes, and then even gave us the thought of, this book should be, let's base it on conversations. Like, if we tried to set out to write the book on IFS and Swedenborg, like, we'd be working on it for 10 years and nobody would ever see it. And but there was so much energy around the possibility of recording conversations and then editing that material into a book. And at that proposition, I thought, I want to invite a third person into this, Jonathan, who is a Latin translator of Swedenborg's works. And because then I, as a facilitator, I have a sort of foot in both worlds of Swedenborg and IFS. Mm-hmm. But Bob and Jonathan haven't met each other. And for them to get to meet fresh in these conversations and have IFS and Swedenborg meet each other, I was just so excited to get to literally be a fly on the wall of those conversations and get to, participate. So that, and it all worked out. It was just so wonderful. And I am really happy with the book. I spent probably about a year or a little over a year editing it into its final form. So it's not just transcripts or something.
Right.
It's been very carefully edited. And so that's how we got here from my vantage point.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I really love about the book. It's really, really, when Bob introduced me to Swedenborg, and he always refers to Swedenborg as being very hard to read. And so when I see some of the excerpts and the quotes, I'm like, oh yeah, I see that too. So I'm very grateful that such a work exists, and this is the most recent publication for the lay person to really access this stuff. And the conversation flows really well. And Jonathan, thanks, Chelsea. Jonathan, I want to rope you in here and just ask, I'm also curious just how you when did you start working, studying Latin and starting to get curious about Swedenborg?
Yes, I too was born into a Swedenborgian tradition. Actually goes back some 7 generations, which is hard to do because Swedenborg is only about 8 generations back there.
Wow.
But and I was fascinated not that long ago. I mean, it's funny because my father was a pastor, and I was interested in ministry, but didn't really want to do the whole pastoral thing. So I decided to carve my own unique path by getting into editing and translation. That really felt like, that's where I belong.
Hmm.
And then I studied some of my family tree, and there's a whole bunch. There's way more publishers and editors and translators in the family tree than pastors. My dad was sort of more the odd one out. I didn't realize I was entering the family business. I thought I was doing something so unique. And I was very, very taken with Swedenborg's psychology, with his explanation of how the mind works. And I don't know, this book is kind of amazing to me because thinking back on it, I realized that when we first started, when Chelsea said to me, "Hey, should we have these conversations?" I really went through, at least a big part of me was feeling very unworthy.
Mm-hmm.
I know Swedenborg very well. What do I know about? I don't heal trauma. I'm not a therapist or what. What do I have to bring to this conversation? But as I reflected on it a little bit, I realized, well, I knew Wilson Van Dusen personally quite well. I'd seen him a number of times. Very taken with him. Very taken with his presence of other worlds. Is that what it's called? And that whole business of sitting down with somebody and actually talking to their voices, and realizing that the voices have a knowledge base that the client doesn't have, and that my head's exploding from that. And the reason Wilson Van Dusen kind of our paths crossed was because he got very interested in Swedenborg, and so he was coming to some Swedenborgian summer camps and things like that, and I got to see him a number of times in that context. And then later on, I found out about this character, Jerry Marzinski.
Uh-huh.
I saw Jerry on your show, which was really great. And I was so taken with what he would, wow. And he is very much an heir of Van Dusen. I think that there's a direct through line there. And then when Chelsea said to me, well, I'm in conversation with Bob Falconer, and you should see his book. And I look at the book, and not only is Swedenborg in there, Jerry Marzinski's in there,
Mm-hmm.
and some other, Rachel Rivers and some other people I've crossed paths with over the years. And so I was just astounded. I thought, okay, this is meant to be. And so that was sort of how I got involved. And the conversations were so wonderful. I think the book does, I know I can't get outside of my own filter, but the book does seem to me to capture the energy and enjoyment of the conversations that we had. I really didn't want them to end. They were so great.
That
so it's a pleasure to be part of it.
Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. That pivots perfectly to a question I had kind of loaded, which was how many conversations, like over how many calls did this book, get created with?
Yeah, there were 9, I think, in total, and we would meet for 2-ish hours each time. And it was such a just delightful rhythm. I guess it was over the course of 3+ months that we ultimately had all those conversations. And I had set out with, I had already been keeping sort of an outline of like all of the topics that I would want to cover from an IFS and Swedenborg perspective. And so I sort of had that in mind of knowing material and areas I wanted to cover, but then just to sit down and see where the conversations led, and just was so delightful to have, just there's so much to be explored. So it was really fun to do.
Yeah, for sure. And the fact that this conversation is, 2 hours or less than is like a drop in the bucket. There's so much stuff here. And Bob, I want to pull you in here. I know that we said before starting to record, like we wanted to orient people to who Swedenborg is. And, maybe you could give a brief outline of that, because I'm also, when I was reading the book, you already said, I've been reading and studying and researching Swedenborg, and yet when you read this book, I love all the questions that follow. Like, what does Swedenborg say about that? There's all this like IFS informed stuff. It's like, what's Swedenborg's perspective? Anyway, Bob, please take it away and help listeners. We've been talking about Swedenborg for 15 minutes, and listeners are like, who the hell is Emanuel Swedenborg? You want to take it away?
Yeah. Okay. I want to say one other thing. We'd have these conversations, and Jonathan Swedenborg's writings, the edition I have, which is the one before Jonathan, it's 30 volumes. So it's substantial. And just the concordance to it is like 6 big fat So there's a tremendous amount of material here to try and digest and synthesize.
Yeah.
So what was such a blessing for me in these conversations, we'd be discussing something, and then Jonathan, in between our sessions, would get quotes that related to what we'd been discussing. And sometimes there were like 40 pages of all these quotes from the 30 volumes. It was like somebody who's trying to study Swedenborg couldn't ask for a more wonderful situation.
Yeah.
Swedenborg died in 1770-something. He was, up until his 50s, the foremost hard scientist of his day. I mean, he did copper mining and smelting and a whole bunch of other things. He also designed some military equipment. So he was not your woo-woo kind of guy.
No.
And then about the time he was 50, he started talking to demons and angels. And he spent the rest of his life dialoguing with demons and angels. And he came to say that he could see them as clearly as he saw people in the street. And he wrote what I think of as a extensive geography of heaven and hell, the inner world. And he did not found a church. He did not have prescriptions like you have to do this, this, and this to lead a holy world. He was just describing the inner world in as much detail as he could. And he was very detail oriented, and he took his scientist's attitude with him. Also, when he started doing this, he seemed to develop a lot of ESP, like he knew there were fires going on in other cities of Europe, and the Queen of Sweden, when she couldn't find her jewelry, would call him and where's my jewelry? Not call,
Yeah.
but all kinds of stuff like that. And he also evidently predicted the hour and of his death, and but I think of him as sort of a geographer, which is might be an odd name. He is very difficult to read. I've been direct personal contact with both Van Dusen and Marzinski, and Van Dusen was the first to use Swedenborg's description of the inner world to work with, in his case, inpatient psychotics. And I think very successfully. And Marzinski did that too. But as you can imagine, the professional psychological people squashed him as much as they could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And can I add a little note about just something I appreciate in what you're describing, Bob, about Swedenborg? I produced a podcast that we called Inside Off the Left Eye. And I know that's a mouthful, but Off the Left Eye is a YouTube channel that explores Swedenborg's content in video format, entertaining video productions. And so I produced a podcast, a sort of sister podcast to that, called Inside Off the Left Eye, where we delved into Swedenborg's history, his own context, his lifetime, because I think you really have to appreciate that this is a guy living in the 1700s in Lutheran Sweden, and then he has this spiritual awakening. He's talking to his own thoughts. He's going through something that is completely ostracized, in his community generally, in sort of Western Europe. And yet he's very affirming of it and sort of explores it with this passion, is very, convicted about it. It's just like, as he says in his book, Heaven and Hell, like, I have seen, I have heard, I have felt. Like he's very affirming of just like, this is my direct experience. What else can I do? Right. And, but he was very alone in it, and it was really not until the very end of his life that he had sort of close friends that sort of really took him at his word in terms of, this is what I'm experiencing, even though he had published, 18 titles about it by this point, most of which anonymously. So anyway, I just really muse or wonder about like the person of Swedenborg and what his life experience was like in having these experiences, even though now here we are drawing on them they've been published and translated in these 30 volumes. And so they are just sort of this inexhaustible resource of spiritual reflection, but he's sort of like a humble character himself, Swedenborg. And it's just an interesting combination, not one you usually get, I think, when you're dealing with this kind of material. Anyway.
Yeah, he's he definitely strikes me as a polymath. And when Bob was introducing him to listeners and viewers here, it said then late in his life he started talking to demons and angels, and his spiritual awakening. What happened? What was the awakening? Is that detailed?
Yes, I've been very interested in this for a while, and I think it had sort of three basic components. I think he was quite confused himself about what was going on. But the first phase was that he started to have what I think we now would call lucid dreaming, and this went on for 6 or 8 months. He referred to it as preternatural sleep. Not exactly supernatural, but something is happening at night that I can't explain. It seems more alive than my daily waking existence. I don't know what's going on. So he started to keep a journal of dreams, and this was way before Jung and Freud or any type of dream analysis idea was around. And then it started to come into his daily waking life, and particularly I think during the hypnagogic state, when he was just waking up in the morning. Is it hypnopompic? That's when you're falling asleep. Anyway, those sort of liminal moments of the day, he would hear music or voices, or his moods would change, or he'd burst out into a sweat or into tears, and was again not sure what was going on. But during that time, he started to have experiences of otherworldly things. He was seeing his deceased relatives, but still it was relatively on a passive level for him. They were like visions, sort of projected, but he's not interactive with them. And then there was a third shift where he really became sort of vocal and interactive with them and able to engage. And he says, while he was still alive and functioning in this world, which he must have been, because he published 3.5 million Latin words, which is not something you do in your sleep. I mean, and he was in the government. He was in the House of Nobles in Sweden, and he was he became more active in the government after his spiritual awakening. So, and there were formative moments where he felt that there was what he says, a manifestation of Jesus, like he's sitting in Jesus' lap. He can see him there interacting and so on. And he says that was formative and sent him to the Bible. And interestingly, the Bible seems to have been an agent after that of a lot of his spiritual awakening, because he was understanding the Bible in a different way and realizing, oh, this is a lot more about spiritual experience than I thought. And his spiritual experiences were informing his biblical studies and vice versa. So that's a very quick thumbnail, but I think that's kind of how that happened.
Yeah. And there's an episode in Inside Off the Left Eye that we cover. We had a little segment called what was Swedenborg doing this week in history? So we sort of ended up having this little timeline of Swedenborg's experiences, but the time that he writes down in his Journal of Dreams or his Diary of Spiritual Experiences, as it's been published now. So he did keep this really exhaustive journal that he would draw on for his published publications. He describes the first time a spirit spoke to him, when his consciousness, he had thought, I have this isolated consciousness. So speaking of like porosity and everything, he thought his thoughts were his alone. And then suddenly a spirit is talking to him, and
answering his thoughts in effect,
Yeah.
I think it was something quite simple, like I think I already brushed my teeth, and the spirit says, no, not yet, or something like that. It was that mundane, but he was so shocked that they were in his mind space.
And wasn't one of them somewhat accusatory, where it was like, you better not do that, or I'm going to
hold your tongue, or I will strike you. Yeah.
Yes, right. He tells him to stop. Yeah. Anyway, and so that's where he starts going through this whole transformation of adjusting to it, and like Bob is saying, takes his scientist perspective and turns it, okay, now I'm going to study this inner world. Like, what's going on here? And he really does. Yeah.
Yeah. As I was reading, I came across one of the that he did a breathing technique to try, like when he woke up in the morning, he tried to keep connected to this world, this realm, and he would use a breathing technique as a means to do that. And as I was reading the book, I looked up the breathing technique, and I put a little Google Calendar thing in the morning, and I was like, I'm gonna try this out. I was curious, have any of you three done that breathing technique?
Well, yeah, go ahead, Jonathan. I can come in after you.
Well, what's curious about it is that he says it's tacit breathing, which basically he says is actually not breathing. Like, the technique is that your breath becomes so shallow. And I think he just sort of stumbled into this because he would, when he was really concentrating on his books, even before his spiritual awakening, when he was really concentrating, he would realize, oh, I don't think I've, kind of taken a breath for a while. I've just been kind of floating in this kind of meditative state. So I don't know whether he consciously tried not to breathe. It seems like something that would just happen when he focused so intently that it would quiet down. And then he said something he called internal breathing would kick in instead, where there was something of the spirit that would keep him going. Right. And so I have not actively tried to do that, but I have noticed sometimes when I'm really thinking deeply about something, I realize I don't think I'm breathing the way I usually do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as we might get into, or anybody will if you're exploring Swedenborg, he describes the spiritual world, heaven, as being full of these communities of people that are gathered, have an association with each other on account of what they love. Love is really what organizes everything in the spiritual world. And he says that whole communities are like a single human being, or sort of can be understood as so it's it's akin to the multiplicity in IFS on this macro level. And so he says whole communities have a breathing rhythm, a certain heart rate and a certain breathing. And he would notice when he was in association with certain communities, his breathing or his heart rate would match what this community was. And so something I love about Swedenborg is that he's so attuned to his body. He practices so much interoception through his works. And so you're aware of that. He's not just focused. He's like, oh, wait, let me check in. What's happening with my breathing right now? And I think in his descriptions, he would seem to do that sort of breathing experience even from a young age, like well before he ever had a spiritual awakening. It just seemed to be something that would sometimes spontaneously occur. For myself, with studying yoga, breathing, you've got pranayama and like the 8 limbs of yoga, and that precedes meditation, or even this word like absorption. I kind of think of that with that our Swedenborg associates our lungs and our breathing with our mind, with our thoughts. So they match each other. And so I think whether one is, we know with mindfulness, you can control your breathing and it can lead to a quieter state of mind. And I think what Jonathan is saying is Swedenborg would get in this very focused mind state and his breathing would match that. So it's almost like, I almost think of it less of a explicit practice than an awareness to tune into and to reflect on your own breathing and then your state of being. And then that sort of opens up possibility for, shifting your state in some way. So
I'd like to come back to something that we mentioned before, because I don't want to rush past it, because I think it's really important. And that's at one of the stages in Swedenborg's progression of getting more and more deeply interrelated to this inner world, he started talking and having conversations. And this was a major change. This is something that's a big deal in IFS. We talk to and have relationships with our parts. And when I was being trained as a therapist more than 50 years ago now, that was considered gross malpractice. That was colluding with the delusions of a client, and you could lose your license for doing that. Jerry Marzinski had to leave a couple jobs because he was doing that. Wilson Van Dusen could only get away with doing that because he was the head psychologist of a great big hospital. So even now, making that step from just observing them, which is sort of the Vipassana meditation, oh, I'm just going to watch it, to interacting, that's a huge deal, a huge deal. And I think in our modern world, the big pioneer here was Carl Jung and his idea of active imagination. He would encourage people to interact with these beings they met in the inner world, not just observe them. I think that's a huge point and something very valuable Swedenborg was doing more than 250 years before.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Bob, for naming that. It's funny. I was, when I'm commuting, I'm listening to The Untethered Soul. I don't know if you all are familiar with that book. And it seems like that author is prescribing, not necessarily interactive in the same way, but just kind of like there are certain points in that book where it's like it's just an object and push and well, you don't have to push it away or bring it up, but it's just an object and then you let it go away. And it doesn't address that personhood component, that active imagination, that, hey, this is an agent with its own consciousness. And if we respect it and are humble and open to it, maybe something more can blossom and grow from that interaction. I really appreciate you naming that. And I also want to, go ahead, Bob.
That is a revolution in modern psychotherapy. I mean, it may sound brain dead dumb to normal people, but for therapists to believe this is a big deal.
Well, and Wilson Van Dusen, he wrote about those beings as hallucinations. Even though he was head, he still did it. He said these are hallucinations until the end, until when it wasn't a problem anymore. It's like, no, I'm totally convinced that these are actual beings. Right.
Yes. Right.
He knew it all along. He just had, to keep his job, he had to use that language.
Right. And I'm kind of curious. I want to ask questions sort of on behalf of, obviously it's kind of self-evident that listeners and viewers, we want them to go read this book, get this book and read it. And also when listening to this conversation, I don't want it to come from the utilitarian part of me necessarily. It's just like, let's just extract the value and give it as quickly as possible. But I do want to ask what, especially as a product of the 9 conversations or however many it was that you all had up from making this book together, what new appreciations or enhancements, maybe something that wasn't necessarily new, but it became more vivid and more real, carries more weight now in your life, or just how did co-authoring this book together change how you embody IFS, Swedenborgian principles, etc.? What comes up when you hear that?
You go. No.
Okay, great, because I want to. I've been convinced for a long time that psychotherapy is too small, too narrow, and we are much vaster beings than that, and that the real dimensions of healing are what we typically would call spiritual dimensions. And Swedenborg just, oh boy, does he open that up, really wide. And, Dick Schwartz, the founder of IFS, and I have had some issues over the years because he thinks, Bob, you keep pushing things too far and, you're going to embarrass us. When I sent him this book, I thought, oh, Dick, you're not going to like this one because we're way out there here. But he really liked it and he loved it. And he made sort of the same point. And he wrote this little thing. I'll read this one sentence. For those interested in the spiritual side of IFS, Swedenborg points to worlds we have yet to explore. So it definitely does that. It's like IFS is here, Swedenborg is here. So, and the other thing is just the amount of delight. When we were having our conversations, by the end of the 2 hours, most of the time we're going, oh, wait, there's this, you know, and there's like 3 kids playing with toys they really like.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Yep.
One of the big impacts that it had on me was that, you know, I've had so much immersion in Swedenborg for a long time. And even though Swedenborg says that the spiritual world is very close and very present, that without its presence, we would not have thoughts. Without its presence, we would not have feelings. That's actually a function of that world, and the fact that we are already spirits living in that world. They're just, for the most part, our senses are not hooked up to that world, except in those sort of extraordinary moments, or for people who have the very thin veil. But still, it sounds so exotic. His descriptions of the heavens and angels and evil spirits and what's going on and all that. And these conversations, one of the things that really amazed me, because I hadn't had hardly any exposure to IFS, had read Bob's book, had I think only one session when we first started, and I've had some more since then of IFS. But it's still, the takeaway for me was that, wow, that spiritual world is much, much closer than I realized. Shut your eyes, you're there. You know, yes. I mean, it's and much more usable, like useful, or, you know, this is something you can just in one 50-minute session, you can kind of enter that world without realizing that you're somewhere else. But when you start to realize how the rules work in that world, it is a little different than normal daily reality, where your shoulder is talking to you and complaining about some other part or something. And that was a thrill to realize, oh, there's way more access and it's more useful. And therefore, Swedenborg's careful mapping, I liked what Bob said about the geography. I think it really helps, because it supplies a kind of structure, an explanation of something that IFS has come to very heuristically and admirably, just by asking people, what do you think this is, or what did so-and-so say, and what is that part helping you or not, and where did this come from? And Swedenborg's, so I think it's something fascinating about putting these worlds together. And that was one of the things that I got out of it, was the spiritual world's much closer than I thought. Yeah.
I just think it is so the best question. I love that you asked it. And like, for me, again, I've had to sort of frame my own engagement with Swedenborg, and I've called myself, like, I do a contemplative reading of Swedenborg, or I do a something, because I have this like grounding in yoga, and I've wanted to engage with Swedenborg in that same way. And I have all of this sort of book knowledge about it, and it feels so potent. And yet it has felt a little bit like just missing that catalyst that would allow it to, like the way rain starts precipitating from clouds. It's like so many great clouds. Let's get it to start to rain. And IFS, and then especially in doing this book together, I feel like it ushered that in for me in a way, because I'm new. I am an IFS practitioner. I'm a certified coach and level 1 IFS practitioner, but I'm a baby at that. But I've always held this like sense of the potential to bring Swedenborg down into that practical level. And this book feels like it's opening the door to that. And so even in my own work with clients, but what I just really hope this book inspires with people is it, like Jonathan is saying, it can start to be useful or sort of add a level of like validation and grounding to what you become conscious of when you close your eyes and when you start to get to know parts. Because coming from Swedenborg, then it you know, I'm very aware of like my own making sense and, you know, figuring it out parts, but they really like being able to kind of make sense of things. Like, there is a satisfaction to not just feeling like, was it totally random that this is this way or that is that way? It's like, oh no, there's this, the correspondence, the meaning, these you know, it's a term, Dick Schwartz uses the term inner physics, I think, and in our work at the Swedenborg Foundation and on the Off the Left YouTube channel, we're often talking about like the spiritual laws or the laws of spiritual physics, because that's so what Swedenborg is talking about. But they're useful. Like, it's really helpful to know. You can actually ask for, you know, more light, which is wisdom and love itself, to come into a space inside of you, and then that's going to have a meaningful impact, or, you know, just, it just opens up a lot of possibilities. So I'm excited for what, you know, already I'm planning a sort of a retreat experience that can bring together Swedenborg and IFS to create these practical applications of Swedenborg's ideas. One of which is like inflow, this concept that Swedenborg describes of the inflow of love and wisdom into our inner self. And IFS is just this like great vessel or like conduit to like help bring it down to this level. And so I'm excited about that for people. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing, Chelsea. Bob, how about for you?
Okay. Well, one thing I want to say, bouncing off of what Jonathan was saying, is the nearness of the spiritual world, and that it actually matters. It makes a huge difference. And we start interacting with it, it changes our lives and it changes who we are. And maybe my favorite quote from Swedenborg, which I never get quotes accurately, but it's close, Jonathan told me. It's close. That he said, many of us think that spirit is some exotic bird of paradise. We have to go to the other side of the planet and deep into some foreign jungle to find. No, no, no. She's right here. And she so much wants us to see her that she's brushing our eyelids with her wingtips. Mm-hmm. And I just love that. And I think that's right. And most of our Western education trains us to ignore that pesky thing. That's get out of here. And that thing can transform us in beautiful, beautiful ways if we start talking to it and dialoguing with it.
Yeah.
Well, in beautiful ways and maybe mundane ways. I mean, I'm literally coming back from the gym and I order Chipotle because I'm like, I got to read more of this book before the interview starts, and I'm eating a burrito bowl and I'm reading about, there's not anything mental or emotional in a human that does not have societies of spirits that indulge and favor it. And I'm like, did the spirits want the honey chicken from Chipotle?
Yeah, they probably really liked it.
So what Bob said was beautiful, but I'm also saying, and maybe in more mundane ways, not super harmful ways, but just mundane, you know. If I could just answer my own question, and last time Bob and I met at the very beginning of the meeting, I just was gushing. I had to say it, but I want to say it here in this context too. This book really highlights the notion of divine providence. It seems like once you're aware of parts and they can take over the steering wheel and all that, okay, great. But the divine providence angle from Swedenborg opened up this, something that he said about God is allowing for the spiritual progression of beings. And I was thinking to myself, so when my daughter triggers me, the part of her that triggers me, that her part and my part are working stuff out right now for their own healing and their own benefit. And the Lord set all that up, or my wife or whoever, right? And I was like, I'm about to do a session with Bob. It's not for Robin's healing. I don't need the healing. My parts need the healing. And again, that's self-evident, but that something about the way in the book divine providence is spelled out, it created that separation, and that, oh, the body's a temple, or my consciousness, I'm here as almost like a visitor to help my parts, and whoever parts trigger me and I trigger them, help them all learn to trust love. And it was that really amplified for me. Like I kind of already knew it, but just reading the book, I was like, I'm seeing that, the effects of, appreciating that more and more in my life.
Oh, I love that. That's really beautiful. And because when you start talking about not only that we have this multiplicity of parts, but also that the parts have parts, it could get sort of crazy complicated very, very quickly. And yet the experience of IFS is, I don't know, this intentionality and that the right things happen. And I love what you said. I think it's absolutely right that it wasn't random, that your day was ruined by this comment, or whatever it is, that it was time. Here's an opportunity. This will trigger this. And it doesn't go beyond what you can bear, although we always feel like we can't bear it. But healing, that was another thing I came away from working on this book with, was the sense that healing is really, really trying to happen in us. And if we give it half a chance, it's not that we have to kind of shove this thing into existence and try to bully our way. Something is trying to happen. And what I mean by all the multiplicity of parts is that there's a unifying, the self is a unifier, as we talked about in those sessions, and as Dick Schwartz talks about, it may be possible that there's only one self that we all share, because there's certain characteristics of compassion and curiosity that are the same, for everybody in effect. So what makes sense of this multiplicity is this unifying force. And I really like what you said about divine providence as basically shaping what happens when and why it happens,
and to that one self thing. When you shared that, Jonathan, I immediately associated to divine inflow. And doesn't Swedenborg kind of say, oh, divine inflow is like, again, it's coming into this vessel, this being, and it's like, I'm a fool if I'm like, hey, I did something great and I did it, versus like, versus it's coming in and it is the divine. And why do we need to separate it?
Yeah. And the most beautiful thing, like that divine inflow, its greatest joy, as Swedenborg describes it, is to be experienced as our own, so it wants to flow in, have you get to have the joy of feeling like, oh, I did that thing, or like, oh, this feels so great to have this unique relationship with this person, or, whatever it is. And so we get to simultaneously have this relationship with this divine inflow, know that it's what's happening, and get to feel like we're more ourselves when it's all flowing through. We get to be at the peak of our sense of identity when we're in that flow. And I think that's such a cool, just amazing thing that I think Swedenborg brings to just the whole conversation of having a relationship with a divine or divine energy, is really clarifying that we are this unique vessel, this inflow is flowing in, and so then we get to be agents within that, but you are still you, that's still just this perfect, beautiful part of it. So
yeah. I want to come back to this again, because there's such a large body of work, and so we just have to trust free association, right, with what's going to come in. Again, for the listener who maybe this is their first exposure of Swedenborg or of IFS, what do you think is? Your book is 300 plus pages. So again, what do you think is some first practical or pragmatic invitations that a lay person who knows next to nothing about this stuff could could experiment with or try out? What springs to mind as being accessible or as being kind of like in the white belt domain or whatever, if that makes sense.
That's great. Well, maybe I'll just jump in and say that similar to what I was just setting up before, I think what we understand ourselves to be. Swedenborg has this line of like, everything is flowing in. So yes, we're talking, there is a divine inflow that Swedenborg says is just love itself and wisdom itself. And so, but although it's a totally weird thing to play with, but if you just imagine that everything is flowing in, but you still are a choice, you get to choose what you want to align yourself with or what you don't want to. You can, and your parts get to do that too, so you get to reflect on, is this something I really want to hold on to, or do I want to just release it? And of course, that's what's going on in IFS sessions all the time, is being able to release these burdens that we took on the burden thinking we had to, and that's who we are, and it's this belief, this or these feelings. And then I think the framework that Swedenborg brings, or that invitation there, is that's very true. It is that sort of flowy, be in this flow, and you get to choose what you want to align with or call your own. And you are very free always to say, I'm not going to identify with that anymore. And that's like one of the most powerful things we can do. And I find in my own like personal work, it's so often, parts hesitation, sort of like, oh, it couldn't be, I couldn't possibly let myself believe something different. But so just this, like, actually this freedom that you have to choose to believe something differently is just very empowering. So that's sort of like a thought exercise. It's not, but that's one thing that comes to my mind.
Okay, I have to, and I really hope this doesn't, please prevent this from tunneling us into a rabbit hole, okay? Because I know it easily can. But the first thing that comes up in response to that is there might be a proportion of the audience that's like, oh, okay, all right, I get that. Let's try that out. And another proportion of the audience that says, I'm a hardcore determinist, baby, and I think free will is a total illusion. I hear what Chelsea's saying, and I reject it. I'm not gonna. I don't think that's good. I don't think it's true. What would Swedenborg say, or what would IFS say? The personified IFS. Again, don't want it to go into a rabbit hole, but I'm just offering that and seeing what you all think.
You don't want to go into a rabbit hole, but you're inviting us down one.
Wait, my part's very greedy. Exactly. My part is like, let's just take this opportunity to. No. Well, the other thing that I associated with was the notion of choice. And say someone says, okay, Washington Capitals play Montreal Canadiens tonight, game 5. I'm going to be stressed out and I'm trying not to drink as much. And I have the choice. What am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to watch the desire. And I notice that I have the choice. How does that actually work?
Yeah.
I know there's a whole section on addiction in the book and everything, but.
Yes. I mean, go ahead, Bob.
In a slightly different direction to see if I can avoid this ever-widening rabbit hole. Might not be able to do it.
I was about to jump in, Bob. I was about to jump in.
The whole city. I think one of the most practical things people can take away from IFS and Swedenborg, and you don't need a therapist and you don't need to read all 30 volumes of Swedenborg to do this. Dialogue with the voices and beings you meet and hear in your dreams and inside your mind. Just start talking to them and listen. Don't just lecture them. Tell them what to do. Listen to them. Ask them. Interact. Make it a two-way relationship with all those beings you meet inside yourself. And that also will give you a sense of choice. Because then you can have these interactions or not. You can say this and not that. We all know we might want to smack our kids someday, but we're not going to do it. That's choice. And that's choice in a very practical, minute by minute way.
Yeah.
And that addresses both avenues that I just raised. It really does, giving people the option to do that. And do you recommend people do that, to journal rather than to voice dialogue in their head?
I think it's better, but I'm a compulsive journaler. I have something over 20,400 pages of journals. It feels like 14 feet on a bookshelf. So I think this might be an addiction issue.
Well, I was wondering, do you number each page?
No, but they're in bound books. They're 100-page notebooks, like those college notebooks.
Got it.
So I'm halfway through volume 205. So
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I can see what I'll be doing when we finish editing Swedenborg's works. I think Bob's going to outdo Swedenborg for output here. Somebody's got to edit it. But to respond, what a couple things came to mind, and I don't know if they address what you're asking, Robin, but one is the idea that came up a lot in our conversations and in the book, that there is a part of us that is unstained and unstainable. Doesn't matter what you've done, what somebody else has done to you, nothing can sully that part. There's a part that's already healed, it's already connected and knows how this should go. And that gets into the IFS concept that parts are not their burdens, so there's a separability between parts and burdens. And practically just in an IFS session, it's so amazing I just can't get over it, where you just say to the managers, could we have 20 minutes? And then they say, sure. Or in one session I was in, I just asked to have some time off, and so that we could have a certain dialogue. And then they said sure, and they left for a little while. Then they came back in, but they didn't disturb it. They were fine, but they actually wanted to hear the conversation. Well, the idea that all those things have, Swedenborg uses a phrase of apparent autonomy and apparent autonomy are things that he talks about, and that each of those parts having an autonomy and the way that you can interact with them. So it's astounding to accord choice to this thing you just met, this thing that you're visualizing that came out of some physical symptom, and yet they do seem to behave as if, I've heard of people, something, a legacy burden that had held on forever, and then you just say, could you let go? And it goes, yeah. And in an instant, it's, so that's a level of choice. And I don't, what would the right word be? I have a very addictive personality. So the things you feel you can't control, and I have great compassion for that thing of, like, once that itchy little thought gets in there, it's very hard not to, it's not like you have a choice about the itch or something. You have some choice about what you do with it. But going into a session and then having a dialogue between the self and the part and changing that relationship, sometimes quite quickly, it is amazing. So in that sense, there is a level of choice in there.
Yeah, that's what was coming to my mind related to what you were saying, Bob, earlier, is that emphasis on relationship that we bring up in the book, where it's like, even if, the way Swedenborg puts it is that the Lord alone, that's his term for the divine, but so, like, or you can call it that divine providence, governs all of our changes of state. This idea of, like, we're not even in control of our changes of state. Like, do you wake up happy or sad tomorrow morning? You don't get to decide, it's just going to be. So there is definitely this flow of being that we're in, and yet we get to be in relationship with it because we're conscious beings. And the word Swedenborg gives to describe that is the importance of reflection. Reflecting on ourselves is really the key thing. And that's one of the even more essential that, it simplifies it even more than what I was describing earlier, but that, like, in one word, it's reflection. So reflecting on yourself and being in relationship with it. If you try that on, like Bob is saying, things might really start to shift. You'll have lots to explore.
And Swedenborg talks about his own practice, in effect, was to observe and notice how everything flowed in, but he didn't just go with the flow, whatever it was. If he thought it was coming from a good place, great. If not, he would really push back on it, say, where did this come from? Why is this appearing in my space, and all that, and challenge it or interact with it in some way. So there was still a Swedenborg in the picture, not just things flowing in. And that was a lot of his practice. He even says that's why the key 10 commandments are phrased negatively. It's not do this, do that. It's just don't do these, just don't do those things.
Mm-hmm. One more thing I could say, and I have parts who get annoyed with these determinists who are always pretending to be so reality oriented, and everybody else has their head in the clouds. So I'm trying hard not to be snarky. My 12-year-old part is going, we can say snotty stuff now. But I'm not going to. Maybe.
It's very welcome, Bob.
What I can say that I think is respectful is that if you behave as though you had free will with your inner world, and you behave as though parts inside of you had free will, things will go better for you.
Yes,
Totally.
Yes.
And that's something we can know. You can try that out, and it's a very pragmatic, hey, this actually works better.
Totally right. That's like, if there are a bunch of theories here, let's say again, and I'm sort of an inheritor of the Sam Harris book on free will, looking at free will as an illusion, or what's the other guy, the Why Zebras Give, also Sapolsky, Robert Sapolsky, all that stuff. It's like, okay, you can come to this with all your theories, but to Bob's point, would you be open to just, like, let's run the experiment and act as if, the William James thing, act as if, and just see what yields better results. And I'm totally on board with that choice. Go ahead.
Well, just that Swedenborg has a line, he is always talking about acting as if of ourselves, that, in a similar way, we act as if of ourselves, but really it's the divine that is guiding everything, and so it's the same paradox. And like I said, I keep mentioning yoga, but I was just reading the Bhagavad Gita again recently, and it's the same paradox. They describe the gunas, which are these, like, the existence, the threads of existence that just create everything that our experiences. But we still are an agent in that, we still, the line is like, you have a right to your actions, even if not to the fruit of your actions, to surrender the outcome. But it's important that we're engaged. So it's always the both and like, not be so quick to have to be, is it one or the other, either or. It's actually way more interesting if it's sort of like, how is it both, and then what happens, if there's sort of a partnership going on between this flow that we're all in, and yet we are these self-identifying agents. Like, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And the alternative to me is just, and I haven't looked a whole lot into determinism, but if it really is just sort of a fate, you were born and you're this way and this happened and there's nothing you can do about it, then I don't know, to me that sort of courts a kind of despair or nihilism or something, because wow, that's bleak.
Didn't you say despair is the magic?
Well, that's true.
I couldn't help myself.
Darn it, you actually read the book, didn't you? Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Well, to contextualize it, you were really saying that the managers, that's where the transformation can happen, because it's like they're like, oh God, it's all for lost, and but divine love supports you, or what Bob was saying in the AA tradition is like rock bottom, and then there's a ground there of being lifted.
That's right.
Yeah. I wanted to ask again. Okay, no rabbit hole this time, I promise. But I wanted to ask the past life question, because that one really was a head scratcher, where it was something like, Swedenborg doesn't really talk about past lives, but he does talk about rebirth or regeneration or being reborn. And I wanted to, if you all could help me untangle that knot in my heart or my head or wherever it exists, because in my direct experiences, past lives are a thing. So I just wanted, how does Swedenborg view all that?
Shall I have a go at that? Well, first of all, Bob, in our conversations, brought forward this very interesting evidence, and I've seen some other evidence is pretty stunning about things that people could not have known, or children walking around telling you how their airplane went down, and what happened to their past self. What Swedenborg says is that he's very firmly attached to the idea that we're just one time here, and then we go to the spiritual world, and that's it. We don't recycle. We don't come back around here physically again. Nor does he, just a footnote, but nor does he believe that Jesus is physically coming back for the same reason. It's a different kind of coming that's going to happen in the future. But there are big things that happen when your soul knits this body and everything. What happens with us? He doesn't believe that your soul just floats around somewhere and then waits and then comes back again in a different form. But because of the porosity of our minds, especially when we're young, he says, just in childhood, it's a sort of negative way to put it, but you don't even have any defenses against it. When you're little, you're just aware of these presences and everything. And so some of what people experience and describe to me could also be satisfied by the presence of somebody who is, did go through that and is with you. You're so close you can't tell the difference between the two of you, because some people, from the stories I've heard, they'll grow out of it too. They, for a while they're very sort of that person, then later they're not, or they, it moves on. Swedenborg also has this, just to further confuse the situation. He says the phenomenon of déjà vu, where you think, you've already had this experience. But what he says about it is that the way things work is that when spirits are with us, they use our memory to such an extent that they think that they are us, and this is kind of a safety device. Their memories don't leak into us, and when they do, it's called déjà vu. I mean, he doesn't use that term. I'm paraphrasing there, but and so it's kind of funny that he says this doesn't happen, and when it does, this is what you call that. So I think sometimes there are sort of leaks of someone else's memory into us, where we're convinced that we had those memories. So to me, it's about the closeness, extreme closeness of these. He says we couldn't even survive without two angels, two evil spirits with us at all times, and gangs of other, spirits. So that porosity is pretty extreme, and that's how he would explain it. But I'm kind of an agnostic. I haven't been there. I don't, on this point, I haven't been there. I don't know for certain. I could be wrong about how I'm understanding Swedenborg, but that's how I think he would speak to that.
And one of the things Swedenborg does say, as we were talking about, of like, one way he puts it is that we are each a unique love, this very unique form of love from the divine. And so so much so that there's at least one place in those 30 volumes where you can almost get a sense of like a pre-birth, consciousness or something, but just like that, the divine that is love itself has a unique, takes on a form that is each one of us uniquely and can be infinite, so it's like the divine isn't running out of iterations, like you don't need to recycle people on the planet or something, like it's not a limited resource. So just the unique vessels of love and wisdom that we each are has an eternity to them, is like sort of the most I see that as just a beautiful way of thinking about what each of us are, like when but again, I think the ultimate thing with sort of similar to Jonathan talking about the way that memory can be shared and morphed, and whose memory is whose, that there's that interplay of our unique identity and yet our complete connection. I think for the most part, we don't realize how incredibly connected we are. And we think we are on the far other end of the spectrum of thinking we're all so separate, but if our whole consciousness of who we are felt more like, well, I am one person that has, connected through generations, going back to the earliest humans on this planet. And there was a sense of, a oneness, like a one human in that, why not? Like, what does that mean for who we are right now, or what our relationships are, or what we're doing in the world right now? Like, I think our interconnectedness is just way deeper than we really ever fathom. That you don't kind of need to think about reincarnation in material terms, but because there's just sort of so much more there. And I always, it's so interesting. I always think of this one great aunt of mine who passed away a number of years ago. And it was when, I had lost my mom when I was young. When I was 10, she died. And so I was much older when I started having anybody else in my life die, so I'd already faced an incredibly intense loss of somebody who mattered a lot. And then I was much older when it was like, okay, somebody who doesn't matter as much to me, this great aunt of mine who passes away, and yet I loved her and I loved hanging out with her. And it's like, I just felt like, no way is she gone. Like, she had such personality, like this personality cannot be replaced by anybody else. I would recognize her out of a million people, and that, I think there's something eternal. That's where I was sort of like, yeah, eternity, the eternity of the soul. I'm convinced, in just this one aunt of mine. And I think that just goes for everybody. So again, that interplay of like connection and yet this unique identity, because kind of like, why not? It's just there's so much depth there. So.
Yeah. Appreciate what you're sharing, Chelsea. Bob, do you want to say something on past lives?
I think there is hard, sober, carefully collected and researched evidence that past lives occur, at least for some people in some circumstances. I think we can say that from a pretty rigorous point of view. Beyond that, I don't think, beyond that, it's more speculative. I personally think, it's very likely, and I like the Brazilian spiritists. They believe we reincarnate in soul groups, and that we keep working out these relationships over many, many, many generations. And I don't think the spiritists know about Swedenborg. And I think these two groups would really do well getting together. Maybe this should be your next book. Get Brazilian spiritists and have a dialogue with them.
Yeah. I'll say that something I love about reincarnation, like sort of an underlying assumption, I guess, that it operates on, is that there is this ongoing relationship between the spiritual world and this material realm that we're in. And it's very, it's not just, oh, it's over in the past and we don't think about it. It's still very much in the present. And, Swedenborg talks about spirits and angels and demons and everything, but he says a feature of angels that they get from sort of the divine perspective that they have is that they experience all of the past and all of the future in the present moment. And that your existence in the spiritual world is outside of time and space. So it's all here, which just to me means like none of it's forgotten. It all matters, and it actually has more connection now than we really often realize, that yes, even and so I don't have firsthand experience with past life stuff or regression or any of that work. I've only heard about it, but that sense of connection that people have to real lived experiences in the past, I think is like, yes, like that's definitely something's going on there for sure.
Yeah.
And if I may, Swedenborg also says that for each of us, we go through tremendous rebirth. He says this is imaged in the physical creation by butterflies and things that just completely change from one life stage to another, just completely almost disintegrate and reformulate and come out with wings and different capabilities and so on. And he says that this kind of rebirth goes on and on and on into eternity. So he's certainly not saying we're kind of one lump of something. He has a very kind of, it's almost overwhelming what he describes. Another analogy that he uses is he says that, and in the first part of this, I'm with him, where he says we're like a seed that develops into a seedling and then has a couple of branches and then eventually gets larger and then it bears fruit. And I think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And then he says, and those seeds fall down and go into the earth and create more seeds and more plants, and it becomes a whole garden, and then a whole grove, and then a whole forest, and then a grove of forests, and then a forest of forests without end. That's what each of us is. So I wouldn't hasten to put a limitation on what a human being is.
Yeah, very wise. Yeah. Thanks for that, Jonathan. I want to ask this question about spiritual fermentation, because that was something that showed up on multiple pages through the book. It like kind of came back, and again in the spirit of sharing things that could be really helpful for people to try out. What do the three of you want to say about the importance of, was Swedenborg the one who coined that term, or did it come somewhere?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, he uses that in his work, Divine Providence. Yep.
Yeah, Swedenborg, just as sort of a setup, talks about the spiritual meaning inside of physical things. And so that, as Jonathan mentioned, Swedenborg spent a lot of time studying the Bible, and he sort of goes through it in this very, imagery. This means that, and, down to very minute detail. But what these physical things mean are spiritual realities. And so this one term he has is like the science of correspondences, this idea that you could, and we could, from all the materials, the physical world around us is just burgeoning with spiritual wisdom. It is the first divine revelation, Swedenborg describes it as, and not just kind of like, oh, isn't that rainbow pretty? But it's like, you can think about the electromagnetic spectrum and how heat corresponds to love, and the visible light spectrum corresponds to wisdom and has these different frequencies, and then how light interacts with different things, can give you more spiritual wisdom. And when I say spiritual, that can sometimes mean like, well, what does that word really mean? but Swedenborg means things having to do with our growth as human beings, our relationship to love and wisdom, like all of the healing journey, I think is really what is spiritual. And so something like the process of fermentation, just this naturally occurring chemical process, is a picture of our spiritual development, and is this necessary process that we go through where truth gets purified, and so even something like fermentation is a picture of our whole spiritual growth process in a way. And then and like we say in the book, there's different ways where it shows up. These I think what is sticking in my mind from what we covered in the book too is the takeaway that there are like fermentation agents, like that to be going through a fermentation process means things are messy and bubbly and all this kind of stuff, but it's actually going through a clearing out process. And then the dregs are going to fall to the bottom. And then you've got this purified, transformed, liquid or whatever it is, whether it's, and so it's just cool to think about that natural process that is happening all around the world all the time is this mirror and picture of our own personal spiritual growth process that we're going through. That's kind of like a general overview of it, but I don't know, Jonathan or Bob, if you guys want to go into any other detail.
Well, I could say some stuff about fermentation. His idea of correspondences, which really is a very, very major idea, that all the things in the physical world have some correspondence in the spiritual world, and probably that's putting it backwards. He would probably, if the spiritual world is primary and things down here are corresponding to that. And fermentation is an important example of that. This reminds me of the Sufis, and they had this idea that there are the sacred books, the texts, but the world is also a sacred text. And we need what they called tawil, which means hermeneutics. We need a special way of interpreting a sacred text to understand it. Almost all religions have that. But the Sufis say you have to be able to apply that to the physical world out there too. So I think that's what Swedenborg is giving us with his idea of correspondences, a way to derive or relate to the spiritual meaning of the physical universe.
Yes, it makes processes that would otherwise be invisible to us or intangible very concrete. And part of what's amazing about the whole idea of fermentation, I don't know who came up with fermentation in the first place, but you purify something by introducing impurities. That idea is, what? Why don't you just purify it? Why would you actually introduce some foreign matter, and then that foreign matter attracts all the stuff that doesn't belong to itself? Then you get rid of all that, and then what you've got left is something clear. So Swedenborg talks about this in his book titled Divine Providence, and it's in a specific section on the usefulness of evil, how evil is useful, and it's useful in a number of different ways, and sort of why it's allowed, and really getting at the whole problem of evil that's vexed the human race for thousands of years. And so the idea of being able to use, I think it's very much like an IFS session where you can use that issue, or if it starts with a physical pain or discomfort, or whatever it might be, or some part is upset or something, like you said, the interaction with your daughter. Okay, here we go. Here comes something that can purify, because I'm triggered now. So, this is when we do the work. And he compares it, a couple of other analogies he used that I think is really fabulous. That if you screwed something into a wall and then you want to get the screw out, where do you press? You press into the screw as hard as possible. Sometimes you're not pressing hard enough and it can't bite and get it. So your entire intention is to pull that this way, and you have to press very hard this way to get the screw to come this way. Swedenborg uses that exactly to say that's how God deals with us, to get us away from problematic things by using those things. Like the very weight of that thing can be used. And so he describes it as being like a heavy stone on top of a spindle of some kind, where you spin it around, it'll spin itself right higher into the air by its own weight. That what's doing it is its desire to go down. That's making it go up. And
Yes.
and another example he gives is rainbows, which he says, interestingly, is a mix of light and dark, like because the rainbow appears in the clouds. He's got stuff about how if it was just pure light to him, it's not as rich. But when you introduce the darkness, you get this whole range of beautiful colors. And so I think that idea of being able to use problems, or what, it's very much about the healing process. It's making good use of this. And I think of it being like, the little critters that eat up your compost pile, or, things that are there to just break things down. They do a great job, and it's very useful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just love that, because I was, as I was sharing earlier, like, that fermentation is a natural process. I think that in itself is the sort of point that if you leave food out overnight for a day, you're like, don't eat that, that's gonna make you sick. Like, things go bad, things rot or whatever. But it's like, actually the natural world, which Swedenborg would say is in response to this spiritual momentum, this that is always active, is like, I've got a process for that, where we turn it into something useful and transformational. And, oh, look, now you've got, vinegar and alcohol and all these amazing things that are, can be used in all these other ways, and not, anyway. So that whole, just that, similar to the providence, bringing that whole concept back around, it's that there's, healing. If anybody were to take away something about, well, what's the useful idea of spiritual fermentation? It's that healing is a natural process. So that means it is just happening. It's going to happen to you if you sit out on the counter overnight. Healing's going to start to happen. And then also that even those, I loved all those analogies you were giving, Jonathan, of like that the things that feel like an infection, something foreign, something wrong, a burden, all of those things are actually this. They sort of, maybe against their own will, they are the part of the solution for making things better, in the long run, and creating more freedom. Anyway, yeah.
I love that. One of you mentioned correspondences, and I reflected back to Jonathan saying, when you close your eyes, you're there in the spiritual world. And doesn't Swedenborg I remember reading somewhere in the book about, like, when these earthly eyes are open, the spiritual eyes close. And when these earthly eyes close, the spiritual eyes open. Was that related to the correspondence also, or no?
I mean, yeah. That's what Swedenborg says our minds are in the spiritual world right now. Like we are in the spiritual world, and it's just almost a focus. A lot of people are more externally oriented, we haven't really talked about how Swedenborg says there's levels to our mind, but so our outermost level, our outer self, is designed to interact in the physical world. It's adapted to time and space, needing sleep every night, all of this kind of stuff. But then we have an inner level, an inner self that is designed to interact with the spiritual world. And that's its basis and its reference point. So it can exist outside of time and space and be interacting with spiritual substance and everything. And so that world is constantly operating on correspondences. You know, the way things appear has a spiritual meaning. Like the word he uses is like represents, it's representative of their quality. So, which IFS is always, you know, these exiles are in basements or buried underground or, you know, stuffed in a cage, or those, might call those analogies, but that has like a spiritual meaning to it. And that's why it's meaningful when you open it and then the part climbs out. That's like real, that's that active imagination, real spiritual correspondences is happening where now that part is no longer, you know, restrained and or burdened in the way that it was before. So that we're designed to sort of see and operate this way, and that's how the inner levels of our minds work. Yeah.
I didn't think about it in this way when I was reading the book, but it just came up for me now regarding correspondences. There was something around like the spirit body or the energy body. You know, the angels can take a look at you. They can look at your left toe or something, and that corresponds to something, has great meaning, and they just already know. It's like your autobiography is written on your left toe or whatever. And I just thought about, just now it came up, I didn't think about it when I was reading the book, but palm readers. I was like, oh, do the people who look at your palm, because again, my whole life I was like, oh, that's nonsense or whatever. But in terms of spiritual gifts, like, yeah, what are y'all? I don't know. I don't have a question here. I just wanted to name that. That's just mind blowing. You know?
Something that Swedenborg, first of all, in his own library, I was surprised to find that he had a book on palm reading, which was interesting, that he had purchased. And secondly, he says specifically that angels, there are angels who have the special function. Angels have different functions, and there are angels who have the particular function, which is so critical, of assessing, like especially when people just arrive after death and they're pouring into the other world, just do a quick read and kind of sort, who are we dealing with here? What makes this person tick, and so on. And they have an amazing ability to read people. And one of the ways they do it is through looking at their palm, and they'll look at their palm and they could, okay. Another one is just to hear a single word that you say, or even just a sigh. Swedenborg says, oh, I see what you love. Yeah, I see what you think. I get who you are. Okay, thank you. You know, it's all sort of fractally held in there so that from this slight piece of information, they can get this whole impression. So it's very intriguing to think about, you know, is there something to that the whole is mapped onto the part, not just even physically, but spiritually in some way.
I'd like to go back to correspondences again, because it's such a key idea in Swedenborg's thinking. And it's sort of foreign to the way we think these days. Perhaps in the 20th century, the closest we get is the way Carl Jung approached alchemy. And the Jungian alchemical approach was finding meanings that evoke spiritual transformation in physical processes, and by studying them and interacting with them. And I think that's what Swedenborg is also pointing to. I also want to say that Henri Corbin, the great scholar of Sufi mysticism, the French scholar, was an ardent fan of Swedenborg's. And a lot of his understandings of the Sufi mystics came from his understanding of Swedenborg. And I think there's a deep resonance between those traditions too. And Corbin was very close to Carl Jung and presented at the Eranos conferences many, many times. So there's sort of a nexus there.
Yeah. Did the correspondences relate to someone said and this was, I think I got this from your book, The Others Within Us, Bob, the 2 angels and 2 demons. Is that connected to the correspondences at all? Those beings, and they're somehow that they're attached, or their job is responsible for guiding or
having it's like, again, I guess anything can happen. So there's a part of me that asks the question like, well, if I've got 2 angels on my right shoulder and 2 demons on my left shoulder, might one of those demons or angels also be on my wife's shoulder? Like, no one can know. I get that, but curious parts of me want to ask, but do the assigned beings in the spirit realm, like guides or UBs, angels or demons, do they relate to correspondences at all?
Such an interesting question. I think probably yes. What I want to like fill in here is what Swedenborg, that whole idea of even having guardian angels, which he does say we all have like at least 2 guardian angels. He'll use that description, and we always are kept in an equilibrium between heaven and hell. And so we have, it's for the sake of our own freedom to have evil associated with us, so that we can explore the contrast and make decisions for ourselves about what we want to do. But he'll use that term association for these associated spirits. Like, we have a lot of the time when people talk about spirits, they're really, and like the voices, in the case of schizophrenic experiences and stuff, as these external entities that have come in, and then there's this talking to us. As much as what Swedenborg describes is that there's a whole level of spiritual interaction that we all have with spirits that is below the radar of our consciousness, that is just our associated spirits. And in Swedenborg's lifetime, those are the ones he would even talk to a lot of the time. He would, but for the most part, we're not really conscious of those associations, even though they are a big influence, and we share our thoughts and feelings with these spirits that are associated with us. And so in terms of correspondence, like, maybe I'll just bring in this, because Swedenborg, as I was saying, we have our inner self and our outer self. And he says that the idea is for those 2 things to correspond, to have our inner self be aligned with the inflow of love and wisdom, and then for the outer self to correspond, to be aligned with our inner self. And so there's a sort of an activeness to that term, correspondence, where it can mean something like we were just describing, like spiritual fermentation has this correspondence with this spiritual process that's going on. But then there's a way to like get the most correspondence you can, and that's where there's this like alignment between the spiritual world and physical world. So in the same way, I think with our associate spirits, yes, they kind of correspond with us in the way that, to say that they're aligned, they're associated with us. They're sharing something of their love. Like, we have some shared loves, or else we wouldn't be associated with each other in all directions. So anyway, that's what is coming up in my mind about that correspondence. But I'm curious, I don't know, Jonathan or Bob, for your thoughts.
I've had similar questions. Something that Swedenborg says that is really interesting to me is that he talks in his book Heaven and Hell about the different roles, the different jobs that angels have. He says that, contrary to popular belief, they're not just playing harps and singing praises of God, but they have kind of an administrative society with different functions and so on. And some people are performing the function of leadership in an angel group, and some are welcoming newcomers and working with them. Some are working with the hells and trying to tame things and keep things under control and guard functions or what have you. So he divides up all these different functions, but then says everybody has, I don't know what an AA they might call pigeons, like sponsees or whatever. They all have humans that they're associated with. So it seems to be outside of their workload. Like, you've got your job, but then you've also got these people that you're sponsoring, so to speak. And I have sort of, perhaps in a silly way, tried to figure this out. One of the things that he says about it is that your associations, and this does get into correspondences too, that in early childhood you're with the highest angels, and then as you grow up, like more in sort of elementary school age, you're down to spiritual angels, where it's very much about friendships and association with other kids, whereas in an earlier phase, it's more, that sort of waking REM state where they are smiling at somebody else and then they look at you and then they're smiling at some unseen being. I think there's spiritual experiences going on, and you sort of wind your way down the associations over time. And then he said there are certain kinds of angels who are with us during adult life and then in old age, and so he talks about that kind of a sequence. But to me, just mathematically, 2 for every one of us is already, there's a numerical question in there, and then also, do you have overlap? Is there shift work? Because sometimes it feels like there's a shift and one goes off the shift, and then the somebody who's only on their second day of doing the job is not doing very well, or so. It does feel like sometimes it's a little bumpy, the transitions, but this is based on nothing, but I really want, but he doesn't speak at that level, like from hour to hour,
Right.
But he does say that when you're in different moods, you are in different, you're associating with different,
It's
beings,
shifting.
and different
Yeah.
whole communities. Yeah.
That's an association I had when learning that there were 2. I felt that, obviously, like you grow up, you read the comics in the paper, whatever, or the cartoons, and there's one. There's an angel and a demon.
There's one.
And when I first read that in Bob's book, there's 2. I was like, I wonder if it's like the grad program where you have your senior student therapist and your junior student therapist. Like there's a mentor angel and a learner angel. Why not?
Right.
But I also
An understudy.
Yeah. But I mean, I also kind of get curious about, okay, well, they're sponsoring humans, or they're in some way responsible, or it's their job to guide. And it's a curious question to say, does Swedenborg say anything about, do we have a responsibility on our end? It's a mutual thing to help them, or to not just be like, oh yeah, I'll just blindly live my life and it's your job to get things right. But like, is it ever mutual? What does Swedenborg say about that?
Yeah.
He says that there are things that you can do to be closer to the angels. There's certain sort of thoughts or states that we get into where they kind of have to hold their noses and back off a little bit because of, what we're going through is alienating to them. In other words, there are things we can do to be closer or farther away. He also says, in terms of a connection, in some ways, I think part of his project was to get us all into a better condition where we could have that connection more overtly or consciously in some way, because he says a big divide between this world, one of the reasons the veil is so thick between this world and the next, is that the things that we are thinking down here are so different than the way that they think of things up there. And partly what he's trying to do is to get us thinking more the way they do about things, so that there can be more of a connection. Because he said in ancient times on this planet, there was a total connection. I mean, you could hardly even tell who had died and who was still alive, because the whole communities were living together seamlessly. But over time, we became more external and sort of turned away. So there are things, but I can't help but think myself that, first of all, when we're going through this process, especially with legacy burdens and things like that, I can't help but think that Swedenborg never says this, but I can't help but think that, wouldn't it be efficient to have some of the people who are with you when you're going through this work be your ancestors who also had this issue? Why not? It would just be efficient. And sometimes I feel like what we're doing is helping them in some way, because maybe they got so far with it, and then we can go to the next level, and that helps them in some way. He doesn't say that, but it just kind of makes sense from a workflow standpoint to me.
Does that track with what the Spiritists believe in soul families, Bob?
Sort of, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Swedenborg does say that we are regenerated, his term for rebirth, in groups. I don't know whether we're conscious of what group we're in, but it is kind of a group activity. And so I think we definitely affect them. In fact, Swedenborg says that we would pass out without we would lose consciousness without the angels and spirits, but they would also lose consciousness without us. They are reliant on us. There's a real symbiosis there, even though the veil is so thick that we can hardly tell they're there. They know a lot more about us. They know what we're thinking and even why we're thinking that or what we're feeling. But the veil is pretty thick for most of us.
Yeah, I love that thought. What you said of why the veil is thick, because what we think about and the way we think about things is just like can't, the two just don't align, but that can shift. Because I really think, this is such a random analogy, but it's coming to my mind right now. I listen to Tara Brach a lot. She's a meditation teacher I follow. And when I was going through a hard time, it was like, just living on listening to her, hour and a half long talks and doing all the meditations I could and all this stuff. And then I went through a phase of like, just getting more involved in my like, okay, I'm going to work. Like I was feeling better, but so it meant I got back into sort of the relentless grind of things. And I went to like listen to a Tara Brach episode and I almost had to think like, am I listening to it at half speed? Like her voice is just so slow and calming and clear. And yet that was the level I lived on for a while. And then when I was in this other state, I could like almost not listen to it because I was like, this is going too slow. Like my mind is turning at 1 million, RPM or something. I just think that that's so true that we have more agency in being able to make our state more receptive to heaven than we think. Like I'm also a body worker, and it's like it doesn't take much to like move your body, shake off the energy, and like your state's going to shift. You're going to be more open to these higher order thoughts, which is how Wilson Van Dusen puts it, like open up to the inflow from heaven rather than just be, stuck in the mud of the outer worldly stuff. And honestly, like, what is the use? But like, it is just joy and like happiness. Like, I think it helps. We serve, I think one way Swedenborg puts it, because we did an episode on this on Off the Left Eye, is like, we feed the angels. Our thoughts are angel food in the same way that our thoughts can be food for evil spirits to live off of. That's exhausting. We can have thoughts that feed and align with heaven, what is loving and everything like that. And then that helps it just helps the whole thing go. Like we're not just a passive agent. We can be an expander, a conduit, and like help share that out. So I, like so many traditions, sort of the ultimate goal that Swedenborg describes as this like heaven on earth, or, like connecting the two worlds, connecting them together. And we are actually active participants in that. So.
Yeah. Well, listen, thanks, Chelsea. I know we're getting close to time, and, it's like, I want to ask you all this ridiculous question, which is, what are some closing thoughts you have? It's ridiculous by nature of like, it's not really a close, right? It's just for this time period. But yeah, it's just, and again, I there are parts of me that are like, Mo, we got to ask about that, or what Chelsea just said. I associate to this, and I want to say, but we're just at the time boundary, So, what do you want to share with listeners before we sign off and say goodbye? What do you feel inspired to share regarding IFS, regarding Emanuel Swedenborg's contributions, or anything else.
Okay, I'll go first if that's okay with you too. Yeah, you're right. Closing comments are totally inappropriate. They would be defeating my purpose being here. I want this to be an opening event,
Yeah.
an invitation event, and I want the main message to be the world therapy has been looking at and focusing in is too small, too stuffy, too constrained. We need to open up to much vaster realms. And one way of doing this is studying Swedenborg and everything he has to offer. There are lots of other things that I think are knocking on this same door. Therapy is too small right now. And the smallness of that is, and I think it's pandemic to our culture as a whole, the smallness of our view of the human mind is really poisoning us. And so I really want this to be an opening, perhaps cracking it open or exploding it open. My 12-year-old's getting going again. That's what I would like, and that's what I'll stop with.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, Jonathan or Chelsea, what final words would you like to share with our listeners and viewers?
Do you want to go ahead, Jonathan, or do you want me to go?
I want you to go.
Okay, great. I don't have a clear thought that's coming to my mind, but I want to just say what a pleasure this has been, and that I think I've just loved most getting to hear your questions, Robin, and getting to, I do wish the conversation could just keep going for hours and hours and keep talking, because there's so much fun in, the beauty is in sharing this in conversation. I'm getting new insights from hearing you speak, even though you're reflecting back on us, what we wrote about in a book, but I'm hearing it in a new way, hearing it from you. And so I just love that. And yeah, I don't know if there's any other final takeaway other than, similar to what Bob was saying, my hope, and I think we did, at the end of the book, we have sort of a closing thoughts section, but I'm so excited for this to potentially be a springboard for people, like you said, to be taking Swedenborg and making it as digestible, like an entry point to start swimming in those waters for people, but especially to I think sometimes people think they need to get all the 30 volumes or, become a scholar or something before they're doing something with it. But I'm really wanting this book to hey, this could be enough. Now go run with it. Go do something that you feel inspired about from reading this book, and then be in touch too, because I love talking about it. So it's and I just, I think we're all on these healing journeys, and the intersection between IFS and Swedenborg is just very, very fruitful stuff. And so I'm excited for people to get to have it.
Totally agree. Thanks, Chelsea. Jonathan, you get to close us out here.
All right. I hope, I just think there are concepts in here that could really help the world. And I know can be kind of trite, but because you're one little person, what can you do? But I felt for a while that we're almost in a situation that happens in diabetes where if I understand this right, I'm no expert on this either, but where you have tons of sugar in your bloodstream and your cells are right next door adjacent to that blood and starving for sugar and can't get it. And you're almost passing out. There's so much in your blood, and yet there's so little in your cells. Your cells are starving. And all you're lacking is one little enzyme to get it across this cell wall. To me, I have felt for a while with Swedenborg, wow, this is being next to a sort of nuclear level mass of information that could really help people. And yet, and I think people are hungry for something, but the enzyme has been lacking to say, oh, this is what. And to me, this bridge between IFS and Swedenborg is a very promising, because IFS is so practical in a way of just addressing trauma, addressing the things where people live, that it makes me happy. And another thing, I want to sort of echo something Chelsea said, that this specific conversation with you, Robin, has just been amazing. I love hearing how you hold it and what you're thinking, what your questions are. And so for me, this journey of entering into dialogue with Bob, which was just thrilling, just so exciting to be in these conversations, and then to be able to take this three-way conversation and bring a fourth person in. I don't know. I'm happy as a pig in mud. I don't know if that's a correspondence, but but I love this.
Well, my wish is that you will break out of podcast land and be able to eventually fill theaters, and how fun that would be with live audiences, Q&A, and things like that. But
oh, nice.
I have to say it's been,
That's great.
I feel super fortunate to have you all here and to share the conversation with listeners. I'm so honored, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Robin.
Thank you so much. It's been so much fun.
Mhm.